Hi, and welcome to this video on data validation. You're doing it wrong? Hey, my name is Eric, and this is actually a topic that I have sort of touched upon in a lot of other videos, but I thought perhaps we should just make it a dedicated video on data validation. And what do I mean by data validation? In very short explanation is that data validation is all the trigger code that we have on tables and we have on fields. So whenever we're doing something that might affect the schema, the data model of Business Central, this is what we're triggering. And I see a lot of code, when people are showing an example in the Facebook group or elsewhere, that you're simply not doing it right. And what do I mean by that? Let's go into Business Central. So here is my Business Central, and if I go into customers, let's see if this one will wake up. There we are. And I want to create a new customer. What happens? Let's follow the mental process here. I click new, and I get template. We don't really care about that. That's just a complication right now. But so, do we have a customer right now? No. So as soon as there are basically two ways that you get to a record at all. And in this case, when we exit the primary key field, so I press tab, now we have a record. So we initiated a record and now it's inserted. I could put in a field. We get field validation because I type something, and then there's actually multiple artifacts from other videos in this database, so don't be alarmed. This is the color picker. It doesn't really matter. I could put in another field, a credit limit, and so the saved up here is slightly misleading, because what I just typed now is not saved. It might be registered in the client, so to speak, or in the service tier and all that, but it's not saved in the database. So when I exit this or do something else, then the data is modified. So we have a pattern of init, fill out if we need to fill something out for the primary key, insert the record, validate fields, modify. And that's basically the pattern for all data inside the entire product, unless, let me show this page. See, I come fully prepared. So we do have a property that you can put on a page called delayed insert. And what does that mean? Delayed insert means that you can see it here, that sets a value that specifies whether a user must leave a record before it's inserted into the database. By default, new records are inserted when the user leaves a control that shows the primary key in the table. So delayed insert means that if it's sometimes used in certain lists, that you can type the entire record, and first when you go to the next line, it's actually inserted. So those are the two patterns we have. So if this one is false, that's the default value, then as soon as you leave the primary key field, as soon as you enter a non-primary key field is actually the proper definition, I think, then the record is inserted. Then you validate, and then you insert. So if we need to insert data into Business Central, that is the pattern that we should replicate in code. And let me show you this. I found this piece of code in the. This is from the point of sale video. If you haven't seen that, go find it. We can take a look at. We want to, in this case, we want to insert a sales line on an invoice. And if you look at this, this is the exact pattern I'm talking about. Let me see if I can make it even bigger. Here we go. So I init the record. Then I fill out whatever I need to fulfill the primary key. And I call insert. And I call insert with the true, meaning that whatever's on the insert trigger gets called also. Then I validate every field I need to validate as if I was typing it. So if I were on a sales invoice and I needed to enter a line, I would type something in the field, in the number, and in the quantity, perhaps other fields, but that's basically what I need. So as when I create this as code, I replicate the exact pattern of how I would do it manually. This has a lot of benefits, and with Business Central, it's even more important than it was in Nav, because you're not necessarily living inside a vacuum. So I don't know. When I'm writing this code, I have no idea if somewhere there is a subscriber to the onValidate event. So if I wrote instead of this, if I wrote like this, let's see what we have here. So it's item.number. So if I wrote this instead of this, now I would not trigger anything. So suddenly I'm a bad extension citizen, apart from being producing invalid data potentially, because I could do something like this and there's no validation. So I basically put in a item number that doesn't exist. So as soon as this invoice would show up on the screen, potentially it was Business Central would yell on you and say it cannot show this because there's something that's not fulfilling the relation and stuff like that. I know none of you would do this on a field like a number, because you need to validate to get the description and all that. But there are lots of other fields where you think there might not even be validation code on that field. It might be your own table, but what if somebody else is subscribing to your table? So your code is first and nothing happened, but then somebody else at some point is subscribing to it. And you need, and then their code will fail because you forgot to actually make sure that you're validating and doing it proper. Let's see, there's probably another example in this one. So this is where we create the sales header. So again, I init helps. Go away, tooltip. I start by doing. Let me see if I can get a cursor somewhere. Yeah. So I start by doing init. Then in this case, I just tell that the document type is an invoice. I called sales header insert. True. Always add the because you need the validation on insert, on modify, on delete, all that, because then you're replicating, because those triggers would be triggered if the user is doing this manually. So in this case, the sales head, the invoice number is assigned inside the insert trigger. So I'm just going to tell what type of document the sales header is, and insert with true, then I get the number, and I can, in this case, I can suddenly, because I do it in another variable, so I can actually set the filter on the screen to the number I was just assigned. And then I continue. It's a bit of a trick to get the UI working in the point of sales app. Let's explain in that video. If you subscribe, you notice every time I I create a new video. I'm doing a lot of them, but in this case, it's you see, it's kind of the same pattern. So I create it, insert true, and then I switch to another variable, but it's the exact same thing. So you create an invoice. In this case, I type in the sell to customer number. I type in the posting dates, and then modify. So the exact same pattern. And whenever you're creating data that needs to go into Business Central, that's the pattern you need to follow. If you're not using the pattern, you might create data that is not correct. So you might be breaking the system. You might be breaking extensions, future extensions potentially. And you're certainly not a good extension citizen. And you get all the added benefits of making sure that everything is as if it was typed. So very often when I'm doing a process like this, I ask my client, so can you do it manually? And there's, okay, this is how I create the invoice. And I write down, okay, they entered something in that field, and that field, and that field, and they use those 3 fields on the lines and so on. And I do the exact same thing in code, because then I know that the result is exactly what the customer wants. So that leaves basically lots of questions, but there's one major question, is that in what would be the case where you would not do this? And there are certainly cases where you could think about not validating. The primary case of all that would be that what you have is already validated, and like if you're doing a data import, you might not want to validate everything because you got everything. So you want to just fill out all the data yourself, because what you have is pre-validated. There might be cases where the trigger is doing something that you really do not want the trigger to do. And in that case, it's up to you to make sure that that you then do what the part of the trigger that you would like it to do. But in general, the doing posting dates equal today, this is bad, versus validate posting date today, this is good. And this should always be your default when validating. When filling out a field in a record, start by validating. That should be your default. So whenever, instead of having, your keyboard fingers trained to do posting date : equal, and then you're off to the races, then train to always just do validate posting date, whatever it is. That should be the default behavior, and that will ensure that what you're producing is correct. It will also ensure that in some cases you can figure out that there's probably less fields that you have to fill out, because validation would take care of them. There can also be cases where the order of fields would get strange, meaning that you could have something that will go back and change something else. So you might not need to, if you're creating a sales line again, you only need to validate the quantity, the unit price, and the discount. Don't try to validate the amount, because the amount would calculate backwards to the discount, and you don't need that. So the simple message of this entire video is, make sure that you validate whenever you're filling out a field in a record. Make sure that you trigger the on insert, on modify, on delete, on rename triggers. Make sure when you're writing your validation code that you're actually putting the validation code inside the on validate trigger, not putting it somewhere else to be called. Make sure that it's actually triggered in the right spot. Make sure that your validation code is not UI centric. I think that's the last thing I'm going to cover in this video. It's already too long. So there's a great command called GUI allowed, and what does that do? So if GUI allowed, then we can do confirms and messages and stuff like that. So we can open a page run modal and stuff like that, because we know that the code is getting executed with a user looking at it. But that might not always be the case, especially not with Business Central, because your validation code might be called in places where there's no UI. And that has changed from Nav. In Nav, we could sort of embed UI pieces in some spots on reports. That's almost impossible now. There's no UI when it's API calls. There's no UI when you're running in the task scheduler, and it's just proper that if you have the need to put like a confirm inside your GUI, then encapsulate inside your business logic inside the validation code, then make sure that you encapsulate it into a GUI allowed. So if not GUI allowed, then do whatever you need, because now you're running in some of those other places. I try to avoid this completely. So if we need something like that, I put it into the presentation layer. So I put it into the triggers on the page, not on the table. But that's just how I approach this. Anyway, this is getting too long, too long of a rant or ramble. So hopefully that my clickbait title was not aimed at you, because you're doing it all right everywhere. I'm also sometimes forgetting this. So this is as much a wake-up call to me as anybody else. Make sure that you validate. Your code is better, it's more secure, and if, again, Business Central is updating every month, so Microsoft might add stuff to a validate function next month. And if you validate, then your code is covered and will trigger that. Otherwise, you might still produce errors even though Microsoft has fixed something. Anyway, if you like videos like this, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments below how you do validation. Is this how you validate? Do you do it differently? What's your approach on this? I would love to hear in the comments. But then until next time, have a wonderful day.